want to hear when something interesting happens. I have my, in idiom terms, my ear to the ground. I want to pay attention, and I am listening for something interesting to happen. And when I hear that thing happen, I am going to jump into action. I'm going to write some code so that when I see that it's happened, I'm going to execute this code. In Java's terminology, that's called a listener. And so for a button, all we really need to know is that the button got clicked. So they have very simple kind of listeners, and it's called an action listener. And a button is going to, when it's clicked, if we're listening to it, that click we can respond to by having an action listener that's listening for that specific click. When that button gets clicked, I'm listening and I'm going to take action. Does that make sense? So let's go right and see what this is going to need. So let's go back to our code. Some of this code is really interesting stuff. Some of the funkiest kind of code that you're ever going to see in Java, we're going to do today, right? It's going to be interesting stuff. So let's see what happens. If I want to do that, let's take something like let's do the beat button. That's kind of an interesting one, So let's take that. If I want to add an action listener for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, I want to have an action listener. So I'm going to say beep dot, right? And I say I want to add an action listener. Okay. What does it want as a parameter? Notice what it wants is it says action listener I. That means what it wants is a reference to an object that is acting as an action listener. It wants an object reference, and that object has to be instantiated from a class that implements the action listener interface. That's a mouthful, right? It needs an action listener implementer, right? And so right now we don't have one, right? So I don't have anything to supply here. So for the moment, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to go make one of those things, right? So I'm going to come down here and say, wow, I'm going to make this thing called a private class, and it's going to be the beep action listener. And it's going to implement action listener, right? And then when I get in here, it's going to say, right, you haven't done a certain thing. And if I tell it to do the magic button, implement the methods, right, and let it do it, it's going to say that it wants you to implement this one method called action performed. Action performed is where you're going to write the code that you want to execute when that action gets performed and the listener hears it. Okay, when the listener hears that that's happened, I'm listening for it now. When that action happens, what do I want to do? And in this case, it's real easy because the toolkit has a way to do that annoying operating system beep. It's not fancy, it's just that bling, whatever your operating system does when it's making a noise that it's unhappy with you about something, right? Just a normal old beep. Okay. So I have to have a class that implements the action listener, and it has to override the require method, of course, from the interface, which is action performed. And then in that, you write the code that you want to execute. Okay. Now, up here, I'm going to uncomment that, right? I'm getting bad things here. Okay, so I'm going to uncomment this. But now what I need in here is actually an object reference, not a class reference. I have to have an object. So now, how do I make an object from that? Well, I'm going to make a new something or another, right? It's going to be a new beep action listener. I don't have to make it separate. I don't have to have the object in a variable or in a global or anything like that, because when I attach it as an action listener, the button's going to actually have hold of it, right? The button's going to have a reference to it, therefore it's going to stay in memory. It doesn't get garbage collected. So we don't actually have to make a separate variable. We could, right? But it's unnecessary because it's going to be held on to just fine, okay? So that's a lot of work, right, for one little beep. But that's one way to do it. I'm going to show you a different way in a minute, but one way to do it is make a class, call it whatever you like, implement that, has to be implementing that interface, which means you have to have this override. And then in here, you write your code, right? Your code goes here. Okay. Questions about that code so far? We're going to talk more about it. We're not done, but any questions about that code?
So you have to make a class per one button, or you can add the other button to here.
Right. So this is now the interesting question. So Idris is pushing us forward in the conversation, which is great, right? The question here is, man, that was kind of a lot of work. That was a lot of work for one button, right? For one button. So what could we do about this? What are different options about ways to make life easier? One way is, instead of making one of these classes